I'm surprised the scale can support this bowl.
It's this scale. I have like 6 of these.
Yes.
Because they're so good.
Yeah, this is the scale that T-Jung used to use at the shop too. Yeah. You want to siffle it to make sure it's fine.
Yeah, because it's very susceptible to static electricity.
Yep.
So sort of like cocoa. If you put in, cold milk, it's not going to combine very well. So this just helps break it apart, makes it easier. You can do it without sifting it, but it's just a lot more work for no reason. In matcha ceremony, they don't sift it. It's pre-sifted before it even comes to the table.
So can you feel the water, or do you need?
Yeah, so you can feel it and get an idea of the temperature. This is too hot for the matcha, obviously.
Okay.
This would probably
what is the temperature we want it to be?
Anywhere from 70 to 75 Celsius.
Okay.
You can go hotter or colder.
Right.
It's probably better to go hotter than too cold.
Because otherwise the flavor doesn't get brought out.
Yeah. And the other thing is, if the matcha's higher quality, then higher temperature isn't going to really hurt too much.
Exactly. It's the same principle actually in Chinese tea as well. Using hotter water actually will only do the better tea more justice because the better tea can withstand hotter temperature, and it actually can bring out more complexity from the better tea versus the lower quality tea needs lower temperature in order to dilute its flaws. Some of the bad quality will show up more with a higher temperature. So brewing principle in Chinese tea is actually to use hotter temperature for the better tea and lower temperature for the more inferior tea, which I think is contradicting to a lot of people's intuitive perception of this. We often get asked, should we use lower temperature because it's the better tea? I was like, no, the other way around.
Yeah. It's funny. Well, when you shade the matcha too, you're reducing the amount of the catechins that are in the tea.
Yeah.
And it's less bitter. It's less, less astringent. So.
Right.
Now, I should have possibly weighed the amount of water that I'm putting in. It's not too important, but you want around 60 milliliters of water. If you put in too much water, it's not going to foam at all. And you'll see when we get to the mocha, that's one of the big differentiating features.
Interesting.
Where matcha is more temperamental.
Okay. Because, back in the days when mocha was very popular in Song Dynasty, one of the metrics that people measure the quality of the tea, or a Cha criteria, which is tea competition criteria, is that the tea is judged by how much foam it actually produces. So the long-lasting foam usually is a sign that this is a better quality tea.
That's cool. Yeah, in Urasenke, which is one of the schools that teaches ceremony, with them, they judge a really good matcha when you pull out your whisk. There's foam on the end of the bristles. So here I'm going to ask a very amateur question, but I'm sure other people will have the same question. How many times are we supposed to whisk the matcha? Well, they say in Urasenke 100 times.
100 times.
But it's usually 15 to 20 seconds until you get a nice foam. Normally you wouldn't whisk this high up. My shoulders raised up. It'd normally be down lower.
Okay. For aesthetic reason. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but you're also doing usually matcha ceremony on your knees.
Yes.
Right?
Oh,
so
that's true.
It's a different form. So when you're doing this higher up, your elbows and shoulders up, but normally you'd want to keep it all down and relaxed and keep your...
I can give you a high chair to kneel on.
Yeah, exactly. yeah. So there you go. That's the matcha.
It's still very foamy, very pretty.
Yeah, it's very nice looking, and what you want is as small bubbles as possible.
Okay. Yes, the finer bubbles, just like champagne as well.
Yeah. So we'll set that aside, and I'll do the mocha. The mocha is really exciting because you see just the difference in how it foams up. So this is the mocha.
Which one is it? The handmade? Ah, great. I haven't tried this one yet.
You haven't tried it? Really? Oh, it's going to be exciting. Okay, so the water's in here, and with Japanese water cooling, we wouldn't necessarily go back and forth in the same way. Use a tool called a yuzamashi, which is basically just a cup that you cool water in.
Right.
Okay, so because mocha is, maybe it's more dense nutritionally, I don't really know the reason. Science, maybe you could talk about that.
Okay.
But you only use half the amount. Rather than using 2 grams per serving, we're only going to use 1.
Got it. I would actually credit to the teas probably just being more robust. So per unit, there's more flavor packed into that unit. So therefore, you're going to need to use less tea to water ratio.
Yeah, and as far as the water ratio goes, I found that 60 milliliters to 1 gram is fine, but you can even do more. So I went all the way up to 100, and it still foams the same. It still tastes wonderful.
Have you tried in between 1.5?
Yeah, well, it's funny. The first time I made it, of course, I just did the regular matcha. So I did 2 grams to 60 milliliters of water, and it was intense. I was like, whoa! And I think I emailed you, and I was like, yeah, the taste, it's very interesting. 'Cause I didn't know how to, like... I didn't know how to, like...
You're like, I'm still so shaky from all the caffeine. I don't know what I'm supposed to say here.
So, I'll measure this one out, which I should have done with the first one, although my pour is probably pretty accurate, but...
Wow, I can smell it. It's so aromatic.
Isn't that amazing?
I know.
Yeah, the mocha is very special.
It is very special.
In fact, we didn't do this, but you can probably give that a smell versus the matcha.
Oh my god.
And the mocha is more complex.
For sure, yeah. That's what I would expect from it being both a historic terroir and also being heirloom tea tree.
Yeah.
So just from the raw material itself, it should just have more exuberance of things in there.
Well, that's an interesting topic too about cultivar versus heirloom. So the matcha that we're having here is from Uji Hikari, and it's from Uji. It's a very nice cultivar. It's not necessarily rare, but it's not something you see too often.
Okay.
Compared to more common cultivars.
It's
more, it's unique. Yeah, the cultivars just don't have the same complexity that the heirlooms do.
Right.
And I was mentioning to you before, there is heirloom matcha and heirloom tea in Japan, but it's not necessarily prized or consumed
the same way. Yeah, I think they must have some historic reasons. Like in China, from the very onset of tea history, it's always been heirloom tea trees. And it's a modern compromise where people want to increase quantity that they had to default to clone cultivar, but heirloom cultivars are prized. Versus elsewhere in the world, I think it's the opposite. People, before they had a plan on what to do with all these tea trees, they had heirloom seeds, and now they have a plan. They have clones, so it's considered upgrade.
Makes sense.
Wow, this is so much whiter and foamier.
Yeah. Well, you can see how fast that was compared to the other one.
Exactly. Yeah, you didn't whisk for as long. I counted. It was only like 65 times instead of 100 times.
And I could have stopped at 35 times, but I kept going for sure.
Right. Wow. And I couldn't resist the aroma. Yeah. It's so much more aromatic. That's surprising even to me. And I love the aroma of green tea, Chinese green tea just in general, because it always makes me salivate. Yeah. I don't get that from other kinds of teas. How are we going to consume this now?
Okay, so normally you'd use a special bowl called a katakuchi, which has a little spout. I don't have that with me. So carefully, we can try to either put it into these cups, or even better, we can just transfer it into
the fairness pitcher. Or we can also drink it this way.
That's how they do it in Japan.
Okay, so I don't mind passing the bowl around.
Let's do that. So would you like to try the... Actually,
I will try the matcha first.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Is there a direction I'm supposed to go in?
So technically, you pick it up with your right hand, set it on your palm, take a grasp, raise it up, and then you turn it twice. And with this bowl, this is a very nice bowl, but it's not the most official matcha bowl, so it's hard to tell what the front is.
Exactly. I'm always very confused with where the front is. But each time, so I'm grabbing it with my right hand and putting it on my left hand. Yep. And when I turn halfway,
once you kind of raise it up.
All right, raise it up. Yep. And do I turn it 45 degree or halfway?
You turn it half, and then the other half. So a quarter, I should say. So in 2 turns, you get it facing the exact opposite that it was. Okay. 180. Yep.
All right. I hope I did it right.
No, that's fine. And then you can give it a try.
If the butt of my bow is pointing to anyone, I'm very sorry. All right, so now we sip. It is very, very umami. And right before the sip entered my mouth, I could detect the seaweed note already. Yeah. And of course, when it's on my palate, it's just confirmation that this is seaweed. Yeah. Except it's not as matcha, but it's very, very umami.
Yeah. So with matcha tea specifically, that flavor is called Ooika, which is the name of the company. But that is a very prized taste. The other
now,
one.
do I turn this matcha bowl a different direction or a different angle?
So when I put it down, I already fixed it for you.
Okay, so I just grab and drink? Or
well, no, you would still turn it twice. Okay. But the thing is, this is mocha. So now we can kind of break rules. This isn't necessarily traditional Japanese anymore.
I'm just gonna go in with like the true Chinese style like this.
We've gone back to China at this point.
Cheers.
So okay.
Wow. From just the intensity alone, I literally could not tell that this was with half the amount of tea in comparison to that one. Because it's not just about the taste, and it's also the texture, the just overall intensity, the thickness, and everything matches with the 2 grams per same amount of water was this one.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? The texture of the body is just as full.
So this one is definitely much more complex, right? It also lasts longer. If somebody don't like bitterness, I would say this one is a little bit more bitter, right? But as a Chinese tea drinker, I would say as a tea drinker overall, I don't really mind the bitterness. It's not overpowering, and it's much more balanced with a lot of flowery note as well. I find matcha is not as floral. It's much more straightforward.
Yeah, the matcha is very savory and seaweed. That's kind of like all you get.
Yes.
And there are subtle notes and tones in there, but when you try this, it's more of a bouquet of different flavors and textures.
Yeah.
And,
I even have some huigan. This is so interesting. Like my so huigan is the comeback sweetness, and depends on where it lands in the channel of the passage. We have kind of a little different hierarchy of it. So if it only is huigan on the tip of your tongue or on your tongue, and it's good, but if it's actually you can feel it on your throat, right? So it's a throat feeling, it makes your throat feel sweet, then that's really good. And I feel that.
I gotta try it again now.
Yeah.
But yeah, you get that, and this is very warming. It feels in your throat, where this feels more on your palate.
Yes,
it doesn't
for sure
go back as far. So
yeah,
this is just a very pleasant tea. It's just very warming and rich.
So for me, also just because I'm just so used to Chinese tea, this tastes more like tea to me.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And this particular matcha, obviously, is a very high quality matcha. Feels more like soup.
Yeah. That's true.
Right.
It kind of reminds me, you ever have congee that has the olive? It's the olive leaves that are pickled in it.
Ah, yes.
You know?
Yeah.
I kind of get some of that in there.
Yes. Oh, by the way, the pickled olive leaves is so good.
Oh, they're delicious.
Yeah,
they're
so
like
good. It looks nasty, but it's really, really tasty.
Yeah.
Obviously, the location of where these teas come from is also quite different.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that's the number one thing that we are really comparing if we're to dissect the details of how a matcha compare with mocha. With matcha, would you describe this the terroir of this location a little bit? What does it look like?
Slopey hills. There is a lot of natural shade there, which is where they think that they got the idea for shading the matcha to begin with.
Right.
So this is from Shirakawa. Uji is likely the most prized area of Japan for matcha and tea in general. And then Shirakawa is a small micro terroir in that region. So it's a very beautiful area, but you do get a lot of sunshine.
Right.
One of the best areas there, I have it here, we didn't try it, is Gokusho, which has the Uji River.
Ah, okay.
And the soil's very sandy, so it drains nice and well, and you also get mist from the river in the morning that helps with the sunshade. But Shirakawa is nice as well. Both have different qualities. But yeah, Guapian is going to be a lot more interesting, I think, as far as the terroirs. Just because Japanese terroirs don't have, in my opinion, they don't have the same, obviously they don't have the same history. So one of the reasons, in fact, the primary reason that you're shading the tea in Japan is because you're not getting the terroirs as nice as you get in China, where you get very high elevations, where you get mists and fog and
the canopy of a lot of other trees.
Yeah, so they apply artificial means of kind of enriching the terroir.
For a lot of the plantation teas where they need to produce a larger amount of tea and the land could not really support this much, of one plant growing on a limited piece of land, then fertilizer would be used. Yeah, mostly because fertilizer actually dilutes the flavor of tea. And for historic teas, because there are generations of connoisseurs who are already used to seeking particular flavor profile, so the usage of fertilizer will dilute that, and it will therefore compromise the quality of the tea, and it can be taken off a connoisseur's list, which is a risk that none of the people from the top terroir would want to risk.
Yeah, well, in Japan, in Shirakawa, for example, he uses organic fertilizer, but it's a lot. They need that nitrogen in order to get the L-theanine high enough to get the savory note. So they're using tons of fertilizer there. Obviously, it's good organic stuff, but it's still fertilizer. So, I feel like with Chinese tea, it's more about nature. Where in Japanese tea, there's a lot more technique and people putting their own work into the plant itself.
Right. Yeah, and in most tea regions, people do cut off the tea, so they do some pruning after the tea season, and they will leave that in the tea field. So that becomes natural fertilizer for the tea because a year is going to pass. This is also a unique advantage to tea regions that only do one harvest for the entire year. So the harvest season is only 10 to 15 days a year, and the rest of the year, tea leaves and then the branches can just compose and become fertilizer until next year comes. So how is this slopey, the area?
Yeah. So you'll get slopes there. In Japanese tea, there's two primary categories. There's flat tea and there's mountain tea. The slope tea is obviously better.
Yes.
The flat teas, let's say Shizuoka prefecture, will all be flat. They use big harvesting machines, usually on train tracks. That kind of go and cut them. But the sloped areas, if you ever see pictures of Japan, you see these like curved bushes. That are zigzagged on the slopes of the mountains. And for that, they're using these almost like lawnmowers that are curved and they just run down the rows.
Yes.
And of course, you do have hand picking, but that's very rare. It's almost non-existent in Japan.
Interesting, because in China, among the historic terroirs like this one, where this tea comes from, hand picking is the standard. We rarely see machine actually, especially for green tea. I would say for green tea, hand picking is extra common. Even if you extend it to some of the high-end commercial teas, they're still hand picked. Versus for other category of teas, it's a little bit less common nowadays, just because the picking is much rougher. Not only is slower, but it's actually really tough on the hand as well, such as like oolongs and stuff. It also has to do with for consideration of the processing method, because if you use machine to cut the tea, then that means there's tons of sorting that needs to be done later on, which is not very suitable for a green yellow tea processing method. Versus for oolong, you're gonna do the sorting anyway. So people kind of didn't care so much of the compromise on this on the front end. This tea Gua Pian, it comes from a very old tea region called Luan. It's a 1,000-year-old tea region. Obviously, throughout the 1,000 years, there are many different styles of teas that have come and gone.
Gua Pian is like 100 years old?
Yeah, it's about 100 year or so. In history, this particular style. But what it showed us is that this is a top terroir, right? So no matter what style of tea that has come by during history and the generations of connoisseurs, they have all recognized that this is a piece of land that we want our tea plant to grow at. It's a relatively cold tea region because it's relatively north and it's over 600 meters above sea level. Normally, you see higher elevation in more southern tea locations just because the weather is naturally warmer, so you need to go higher in order to achieve the same cold environment. The harvesting season, therefore, is very late because spring comes pretty late. It's usually after April 15th. That's when the tea is ready to be harvested. What about this particular tea region?
So with Uji is one of the more northern tea regions in Japan. So there's pros and cons, right? One of the pros is it's very nice. It's a good tea region. The tea likes the difficulty. It gives it character.
Exactly. Colder weather.
Oh, I know I'm at tea drunk. But what's interesting too is because Uji is more northern, the number of cultivars they can use that are frost resistant is fairly small. But when you go down to, let's say, Kagoshima, which is very far south, at least in regards to how small Japan is. But when you go down there, it's much warmer. So they have way more cultivars, way more variety. But what's funny is that also affects the tea culture. So in Uji, yes, there's certain cultivars that can't grow there, but on top of that, you won't use certain cultivars for matcha. Matcha has very specific cultivars that can be used, and if you're using anything else, you're one of those other prefectures that's more experimental. But Uji's the oldest, so as far as tea goes, it's sort of the prime tea region of Japan, and today it's a very small production. It's mostly very high-end teas. So matcha, gyokuro. That's pretty much it. You have some other ones, but
like known for its umami.
Known for the umami. They're more pricey. They're more expensive. And they do more traditional style harvesting methods. So, for example, this tea that we had is handpicked. Tazumi is
nice.
Yep. Yeah. So you get it there
because
it's more expensive anyway.
For sure.
And also, the other big thing we didn't talk about at all is the shading.
Yes. Yeah. So it's interesting that you brought it up. The shading practice in Japanese high-end tea is so common, versus in China it's a practice that pretty much doesn't exist, because for a lot of the traditional tea region, they already have natural shading, and that's almost like a criteria for scouting these best locations. So the reason I'm gonna guess that this place can sustain itself as a top terroir for 1,000 years is because it naturally exists as a prime spot or prime terroir for tea. Because in Chinese, we do have a saying about tea cultivation is that tea loves a yin environment, as in yin and yang. So think about the yin terroir usually is more damp, it's well shaded, it's kind of dark. Almost like a little creepy feel. To be honest, some of the best tea regions are kind of creepy at times.
That's amazing.
And they're very foggy.
Yeah.
So you do want the tea to face the sun. So plenty of sunlight, but yet at the same time, it's diffused or dispersed by other means. So it's semi-shaded and have the sunlight at the same time. This is like where I find tea being so picky. It's like you can't just put tea completely shaded area, because then it could lose some of the complexity. But you wanted some of the sunlight, but yet you want it to be well shaded. This is how you get such exuberant flavors in tea that is well balanced with its complexity.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So the most common, which you would find with most matcha, let's say even most tea houses and high-end places too will have it, but they directly cover the bush.
Yes.
So they take a tarp and they stretch it over the bush. After a week, they put a second one on.
Okay.
We can talk about why that's not so good.
Okay.
But the second,
so it just layers on the shade?
Yeah, so one layer on for about a week. It blocks about 70 to 80% of light. And then a second layer that blocks 95 to 98% of the light for another week. And then they'll shade it for anywhere from 2 weeks on the low end, all the way up to, I should say, 20 days on the low end to 60 days on the high end. But there's other shading methods. So one is called canopy, tana.
Yes.
And that's where they build a structure.
Yeah.
And nowadays it's built with metal poles and black plastic.
Right.
Now the benefit of that is you're not actually constricting the tea bush.
Right.
So the leaves can actually reach up and it changes the shape.
Yeah, and I'm gonna say probably the shade is more gentle as well.
Yes.
Right. It's not like completely black out. It's you're allowed, because that space probably allows something to come through.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it also makes it easier to handpick if you do that.
Right.
Which most people don't. But if you do, the leaves kind of grow in a way where they're outstretched and you can pluck them. But the best way of all is called hanzu. Now, hanzu is what you think of when you think of like covered, shaded bushes in Japan, which is bamboo and reed.
Yes.
Now, there's some really big benefits of that. So one, with the hanzu shading, you have reeds actually blocking the light, so there's diffusion and specular highlights.
Yeah, so it mimics nature even more closely.
Yep. And also when it rains, the rainwater filters through it and it brings down the nutrients from the natural material.
Interesting.
And that, they say, affects the flavor of the tea as well. But the problem with it, first off, when you build the structure, you can't use it again next year. Huge expense. Very big tea fields you have to cover. You can't reuse it. It's destroyed, and then if wind comes and blows it away. But it gives the farmer more control. They can add areas, they can remove areas of it.
And of course, they produce the better tasting tea.
Yeah, better tasting tea. Yeah. So those are the three different shading methods that you see. In Uji, you're going to have more people willing to go through the expense of the traditional hanzu. The main tea regions, most matcha will never be shaded like that. It's very specific.
Yeah, you're talking about the best practices, which oftentimes is not being observed throughout the industry. Yeah, so I love how it's for each method, it's just a step closer to what nature would give us, right? Yeah, so in fact, when we're scouting the top terroir, or past connoisseurs, when they have scouted this top terroir, they're basically looking for the same metrics, but naturally already existed in nature. So very steep slopes, because you want a valley shape that alone can diffuse some sunlight as well. And also good tea trees, especially the bush style tea trees, they'll naturally exist under the canopies of other trees or right by rocks, so the drizzling water through the rock also bring minerals down to the tea. Of course, it's very foggy to the point sometimes you could rarely see people.
Amazing,
yeah. And this particular tea region, I just wanted to mention the biodiversity of this location is amazing. If you just go to this region, you just feel like you're just in deep high mountains. The tea plants don't really just exist, a whole row. Like you really need to get very close to where the tea plants are to recognize that, okay, you're in the tea field. Otherwise, when you look from afar, it's just forest. And that's where you want the best tea to come from. They're literally just tea trees in the forest. From afar, you could not see a formation or anything. And it's so steep. Every year I pretty much fall into, and one year I actually fell into a tomb.
A tomb?
Yes, whoa. Because they have this region. They have this tradition of burying their relatives, the dead ones.
I hope the dead ones.
The dead relatives, near home, kind of, yeah. So in the mountains that they live in as well. I really love like the way they view death, because they for elderlies they will even prepare a coffin years before they pass away, which I would think in other regions in China people think is very disrespectful. But when I ask the villagers why they do so, they're like, well, because then the person can have a say of what kind of coffin I
want that color.
Exactly. They're like, so they don't leave that very important decision to people didn't get the memo, right?
That's really cool.
Yeah, and also they know for sure that they have one ready and that they can just sleep in. And but anyway, so they have all these tombs that are just like in the mountains, and there is one near one of the prime spots for our tea. And one year I slipped and fell, and I got up. I realized I'm in this tomb, and I freaked out. I was like screaming and trying to come up.
God.
And the saddest part is everyone around me, the tea pickers, were just laughing instead of rescuing me.
We put our relatives in and visiting tea experts.
Yes, exactly. And then later when I bring people in, pretty much everyone always fall. One year we were trying to measure the slope. We fell like so many times as we were measuring the slope.
I think that's a unit of measurement, how many times you fall. Exactly. This is a 3. We've fallen 3 times.
Right. And then I remember the person who was helping me with that, she was like, well, now we know it's steep. We don't even need a measurement to know.
So I have a question for you.
Yes.
So with Japanese tea, one of the hallmarks of it, whether it's matcha or anything else, although there's some exceptions, is that it's steamed.
Yes.
And with uji, it's steamed very briefly.
Yes.
But as you go down like to Shizuoka, where there's more direct sunlight, it's a lot more intense. They steam it longer to try to tone down that astringency. But with the guapian, with Chinese tea, what do they do to do the kill grain?
Yes, yeah. So obviously, a very important part of making green tea is to apply high temperature to the leaves to destroy the enzymes. And for Chinese tea, I would say both wok fry method and also bake dry method are the most common. So this one is wok fry first to destroy the enzymes. It's actually 100% handmade. So not only is it 100% hand picked, but it's 100% handmade. This tea never ever touched any machinery, and it's a very small batch that you make. And after that, the tea goes through many other different steps. But long story short, the finishing step is putting the tea bamboo trays and charcoal baked to its complete dryness. So this is why it's considered a baked dry green tea. And that definitely helped to attribute to the flavor differences between the two. Yeah. So steamed green is not as common in China nowadays. I would say Japan definitely is the more common place where you'll find that technique. And steamed green tea usually has a milder flavor, but the tea oftentimes can be characterized as being greener, right? Yep. Versus a baked dry green tea usually have more, or Chinese green tea in general, because the temperature is much higher, you feel more nuttiness in the tea. The tea feels drier as well. And
reminds me of a longjing.
Yes, especially longjing, right? Because it has been rubbed against the wok for so long. And the in terms of comparing a tea that didn't get baked dried, or Chinese tea, baked dry is actually considered a milder method, but still you feel that it's stronger than a Japanese green tea. And talking about the shading, another flavor difference between the two, for example, the very much enhanced umami in matcha, a lot of it is due to the shading, because shading is what we do to enhance the amino acid content in tea. So you can consider the flavor in tea is almost always a ratio, right? So the three essential component in tea that give you the actual tea taste, and also the three is pretty much essential for tea plant to like become a tea plant, is the amino acid in tea, mostly L-theanine, the polyphenol in tea, which is a catechin, and then a few different kinds of caffeine compounds in tea. The amino acid in tea mostly contributed to the umami taste, and the catechin in tea is what give us the tannic mouthfeel, and caffeine is bitter. So it's about the well-structured relationship of these three that give us a sense of balance within the tea. And of course, there are aromatic compounds that could add to the complexity of the tea overall as well. Now, with shading, that really increase the amino acid in tea, and therefore it becomes a more overpowering element in the overall flavor profile. So you will perceive the tea as smoother, more savory even, versus more bitter or more astringent.
I feel like for anyone who's very new to tea and they've never had green tea, or at least in small amounts, they wouldn't even recognize necessarily that this is green tea.
Exactly.
It's just so different. And one of the things that's interesting about the L-theanine, and this number I need to verify before I say it on camera, but I'll say it anyway, is that with Japanese like sencha, which is the traditional regular green tea, that's not shaded, about 2% of the tea is L-theanine, but with matcha it goes all the way from 5 to 6%.
Right.
So it's much, much stronger. We're talking double, sometimes a little more than that, of the L-theanine content. And what that makes me think of is with Japanese tea, the aim is different than Chinese tea.
For sure.
Totally different purpose.
Yeah, exactly. So Chinese tea is always focused on complexity and balance. So a tea that is overly synthesized on one tasting note, and that could also be a natural flaw of a lot of clone teas, is that it's too straightforward, therefore it's too simple. So it kind of take away what Chinese would consider a more sophisticated flavor profile. Chinese tea definitely wanted a more fair representation of all three. And another thing about shading is that it actually also decreases the caffeine content in tea. And I can consider why they don't want to shade the tea early on, because caffeine is an essential compound in tea for it to do its photosynthesis. So if you shade the tea very early on during its rapid growth stage, then it could damage the tea's health. So you only want it to do it kind of like when the tea is more grown up.
Right at the end before harvesting.
Right before harvesting. And so that further increases the ratio of the amino acid to caffeine, and then also to catechin as well. So, but Chinese will consider that like imbalance.
Right. And with Japanese, it's not so much complexity and balance that they're looking for; it's freshness and umami.
Exactly. So, Japanese green tea definitely put a lot of emphasis on freshness, and it's especially it's a very green tea dominated tea culture. People would often put green tea in a cold storage, right? To preserve its freshness and prevent oxidation, which is the number one enemy for green tea.
Even though with Japanese tea, freshness is obviously one of the most important aspects of it, because it's cold stored, it's normal to have, let's say, a tencha that we grind into matcha. This is the unground matcha tencha. You can have it 3-4 years old, and put into a completely fresh matcha because it's been cold stored. So even though we think of Japanese tea as very, very fresh, it can be using material that's significantly older than what we would consider fresh in Chinese tea.
Exactly. Versus Chinese tea, modern days people also would put their green tea in the refrigerator or in the freezer, but I usually would not recommend doing that for tea vendors, because then the customer is going to face a problem of condensation. It's very difficult to maintain that cold chain storage from the time that you purchase the tea from the vendor to take it home and maintain the same environment. However, Chinese green tea usually is much, much drier though for high-end teas,
Yes.
like especially for like this guapian. For those of you who have enjoyed T-Zhuang's green tea, I think you notice a significant difference of T-Zhuang's green tea compared to even other Chinese green tea is that it has much lower risk to oxidation. It's much less likely to oxidize.
Yeah.
And this is a very important criteria to judge the quality of the tea as well. But because we do not have the prevalent tradition of cold stored tea, so vintage become very important.
Yeah.
And throughout Chinese history, because it's a green tea dominated history, there is this mantra, it's called tea price freshness. So green tea being fresh is very important. But I understand because for matcha, because the cold storage, the advantage of that, and a single vintage is not so much a common practice.
No, not at all. What happens with matcha is typically companies will have people called chaxi, which are master tea blenders.
Right.
And with matcha, there's a tradition of blending the tea. So not only do you pick from individual cultivars, but you also pick from different vintages.
Right.
But the aim is so much different because with Chinese tea, every new vintage is exciting, right?
Exactly, because you not only get to taste the terroir, but you also get to taste what the seasonal changes has happened to these tea trees and to the terroir. So this provides endless excitement for the connoisseurs. Yeah.
But with Japanese tea, it's exciting to have a new harvest, but that's not the point of it. Right, so the point with any company is to make sure that the matcha we serve this year is the exact same as next year, as 10 years from now, as 50 years from now.
Right.
Now that's a problem because teas change.
Yes, and in China, actually, for commercial teas, that's a very common practice as well. And they usually will have a person who's particularly good with their taste bud, and this is where experience really comes into an advantage. So this person would not only blend the tea, but this person is essential for this person to pretty much remember what the tea tastes like for the past 10, 20 years in his or her tenure here, so they can make sure that they blend the tea to taste exactly like the previous years. One might ask, okay, why can't we just bring a previous year's sample here? It's because that previous year's sample, before it's blending again for the new product to come out, would have changed its flavor when it was first blended. So this is why people need to kind of have a almost like a memory that's being carried forward to know what is this consistent tasting. So it's, in a way, in terms of just how common it's practiced, it's also very, very commonly practiced in China to blend tea. It's just that at T-Drunk, we do tea at a different caliber. So the historically famous teas, though, having consistent taste year on year is actually a bad thing, right? That means people know that you have blended your tea. People want to taste the vintage differences. So to have this project rolled out, we're going to do something that's quite unique, right? So we're going to feature 2 vintage guapian. Both are the freshest from 2022. One is 100% handmade, and the other one is semi-handmade. So semi-handmade, by the way, majority of it is still handmade. It's just the very beginning was not stir fry the tea in the wok. And then we will have a multi-vintage one as well to really have a side-by-side comparison with a stabilized factor, which is same location, same producer, but one variable, so we can try the difference.
Yeah, it's going to be very exciting. So I've tried all of them, and it's so fascinating to see how it changes between them. And the thing is, with the mochas, they're so complex that even the single vintages taste blended in a way. At least coming from matcha, where a single cultivar is not two-dimensional, but it is more straightforward.
Another interesting thing is that because heirloom tea trees is basically nature's blend. So you talk about blending cultivar, right? So a single vintage obviously is not multiple vintage. However, a heirloom tea tree, by definition, you plant every tea tree with a seed. So it's a sexual production, and just like human, everybody was born different, right? It's not clone humans.
Not yet, anyway.
Yes, yeah, you never know. Because of that, it's really just nature's selection. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of nature's representative of diversity.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
And the reason that we wanted to have Mo Cha with a Chinese tea is because the tradition of grinding tea and drinking powder tea actually came from China.
Yeah.
Right? Here, I just want to clarify a concept. There's the history of tea and there's the history of tea culture. And there's a saying in the academic world to talk about tea culture is that tea culture started with tea making. So you can consider before, even though we had a tea plant, in China, actually, majority of the tea history is a history of cultivating this tea plant, and we will eat the tea plant as is a vegetable. And we might drink it, but it's not a standalone beverage. Or we minimally process the tea leaves, right? You're merely just cooking it down into porridge, things like that. But once we discover that we are actually able to apply other method to manipulate these fresh tea leaves into other flavors, and there are so many possibilities that can give us the different style of teas. So the tea making started. That's when tea culture really emerged, and we can consider that's what elevated tea from a regular agriculture product but now into a sophisticated beverage. So that change happened in Tang Dynasty. And during that time, a lot of things are still kind of in between. People will season their tea.
Salt, scallions, ginger.
Yes, exactly.
I'm still waiting to try that.
Yes, maybe we should try that one day as an event. I think that'll be really interesting.
That'd be awesome.
So during that time, tea will be pressed into various sizes of cakes or even small ones, and people will need to break it before they enjoy the tea. So it becomes busy tea because it's pressed and you break it apart. That's, you can consider almost like the first generation of a non-whole leaf tea, but which is actually the oldest form of tea once we had entered the era of tea culture. So that's the first milestone. And the second milestone is in the dynasty that followed the Tang Dynasty, actually start to emerge in between. There was like a chaotic period between Tang and Song Dynasty. So grinded tea kind of started during that period, but it really became a thing in the Song Dynasty, where people start to grind the tea in a much finer form. So it's really milled into powder. And it's no longer just like busy tea. And people start whisking the tea, and that is when Mo Cha first came about. And in fact, the Chinese word for Mo Cha also has evolved along the way, and that's also during that period of time the method of drinking tea went to Japan and became matcha. So matcha is actually a Japanese adapted pronunciation of Mo Cha.
And it's the same characters, isn't it?
Yes, it's the same later character. It's not the same original character that the Chinese have used to call Mo Cha.
My kanji's not very good, but I looked at that and I'm like, wait a minute, that's matcha.
Yes, it looks very similar. So at the very beginning, Mo Cha, these Chinese words are hieroglyphics, so everything is a picture, and it is kind of easy to recognize. So the original word Mo Cha literally means powder tea. And later on, we have put in a hand next to it, so it's like hand with your powder tea, and that become the current day character for matcha. So which kind of makes sense, right? And you, in a lot of ways, you can consider Chinese characters are just like emojis, right?
I like that.
And as things and our perception of things evolve, we change that character as well. There are a couple of differences between the Mo Cha back in the days and the Mo Cha nowadays, right? So the Mo Cha back in the days, for one, it was a steamed green tea, which currently, as we know, it's hard to find in China now. We still have, there's actually a tea in Chinese, it's called Yulu, which basically is gilkuru, that's still steamed, but it's also enjoyed as a loose leaf tea. But anyways, it was steamed, but most importantly is it's then pressed. And people would still break that pressed tea apart, and they will grill the tea right before grinding.
That's pretty interesting,
Yeah, so you can consider it's almost like, in terms of processing the tea, it's almost like a combination of steamed and baking. And in a lot of ways, it does bring it closer to what Mo Cha nowadays, which is at least the one that we are presenting here is a bake dry green tea, right?
Yeah.
So they'll bake it over fire right before they start grinding it, and they'll grind, they sift, they whisk. So all of that is very much the same. Yeah.
That's interesting too, because there's one region of Japan that toasts their tencha before they mill it. Uji doesn't do that. The more south they do that. They actually, it's called a hire. It's a firing process where they do just that. They fire
I would be interested in trying that and then see how it'll turn out. Okay, awesome. Yeah, and then the tools at the time that people that get involved pretty much is very comparable to the tools in a Japanese tea ceremony, and the overall process also pretty much get preserved through Japanese tea ceremony as well. So you can see that continuity over there. And during that time, however, people definitely prize on the fine and long-lasting foam on top of their matcha. In fact, they will have these tea competitions called doucha, which still means tea competition both in China and in Japanese. And but the tea competition nowadays in China is, is basically it's like a taste evaluation. But back in Song Dynasty, the tea competition is how well you can make, how long you can make the foam stay on top of your mocha, and also sometimes it's with the elaborate art you can make with the foam. So very much like amazing. The latte art today. Yeah. In fact, because there's
it's
so
fad,
many...
everything goes through cycles, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And because, you cannot just pick up a well-whisked bowl of matcha to drink if there's not some pretty art on top of it. And nowadays in China, there are people try to revive that part of the culture, even though it's very hard to find the exact mocha being duplicated. But people will also try to draw the mountains and water paintings on top of the foam, which is quite amazing if you look at some of the
Submit
pictures.
yours when you get your mocha to Instagram.
We should have that
That's a great idea. Not ironically, let's do that.
Yeah. And another very important culture impact of that part of the tea history, the foam on top of your tea is white. So black porcelain was prized during that time. And it's most famous from this location called Tianmu. And that actually also went to Japan and became the Temoko style of teaware. In China nowadays, you still can find them in the style of jianzhan. But of course, nowadays, we put clear liquor in it, and it's a different experience. And of course, nowadays, because we drink tea out of smaller teacups, so now the jianzhan are much smaller. If you live in New York, or maybe you can find it in your local museum as well, but the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City actually have a very interesting collection of the black porcelain from Song Dynasty, and also its contemporary from Japan as well. Wow. And so you can see and just, I guess, put some imagination in how the original mocha and its white foam looked against the black porcelain.
The tea culture in Japan starting out, it was Japanese monks that went to China and then picked up the culture and they brought it to Japan. But what's funny is originally it was in Japan as this very monk thing, but then the nobility got into it.
Right.
And it became this massive, big thing where they would have tea competitions where you would try to guess what region of Japan the tea came from. Whether it's real true from Uji or whether it's from somewhere else. And it got so popular that the government banned it because people were gambling with tea.
Interesting.
It became a whole gambling thing. Well, eventually, and by the way, all of the bowls were from China and Korea, and basically you'd have the nobility getting together, having these big events where they bring their bowls and their teaware, and it was a whole thing. Well, eventually, the monks brought it back to becoming a private practice. Sennu Riku. Riku was probably one of the most famous who brought back wabi cha to the Japanese practice, and that's what we have today.
Right. And he himself was quite a playboy when he was young, right? And then later decided to become a different person and preach using tea to as a way of having a simpler and more humble life.
Right, and one of the ways that they did that was introducing tools that were part of Japan. So bamboo, you'd never use that with tea ceremony before that because that's a common, material, so they started using kitchen bowls and things that weren't from China, things that were from Japan. It became a very Japanese practice. So it's interesting to see how it's evolved, not just in terms of producing the tea, but also how it's consumed, and how the Japanese converted it from a very specific Chinese practice into one that uses shading, into one that just has different, personalized, I guess you could say, methods to drinking it and also producing it.
Yeah, it's kind of not exactly the same transition, of course, but it kind of followed the same path in China as well. In Song Dynasty, actually all the way till late Qing Dynasty, tea has always been very much a aristocracy thing. So in Song Dynasty, a emperor actually even wrote a book on tea, and in that book, it's so elitism, right? He will criticize, he will project his ideals through tea and talk about how foul commoners will never appreciate the pristine virtues that the tea have, and so very much comparing virtues with tea, and that's just part of the very long history in China where we philosophize the practice of drinking tea and to try to project human ideals through tea as well. And it was not until Ming Dynasty where a emperor considered, actually the first emperor, who considered that a process of making tea and drinking tea was too much a burden to commoners, where they need to produce these teas as a tribute item to the more elite class in China. So as part of I guess show of his benevolent ruling, he abolished the practice of pressing tea, and it's actually with that we have the birth of loose leaf tea. So loose leaf tea actually, if you had to count using timeline as a guideline, is a less traditional way of drinking tea. It's a style that came much later, and it was during Qing Dynasty that tea where the tea production started to increase in China, and tea started to become a thing that both the commoners and the high class folks all enjoy. And I still remember one of my favorite novels. In there was a guy who what do you call the person who pulled like a carriage? Yeah, but anyway, so back in the days, it's a very common way of transportation, a guy who pulls that. And in the novel, so he oftentimes go to these tea houses to hang out with his buddies. And of course, in these tea houses, they're called tea house, but really you kind of almost just like pay a flat price and then you just chat there all day. They don't care what tea they're drinking. It's more for them just like a place to hang out. It's almost like the cheap ale. And then one day he had more money. He went in and then he's like, I want to see the tea list, and I want to order tea. Like, he actually want to have an actual like high quality tea where before he couldn't afford, and his buddies are all like, "What happening here?" Yeah, so
it's like going to Starbucks. I'll take the pour over today, not the drip.
Something like that. So during end of Qing Dynasty and the beginning of the Republic, you start seeing the tea definitely become more and more a commoner thing. And then some of the excavated teaware from Tang Dynasty, they are made of silver and gold, which is very impressive.
I got fake gold on my bowl.
Okay.
Not trying to brag, but
no one could tell. You could just like say that these are real gold.
That's what I meant. This is real gold.
Right. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Another reason that why we want to introduce Mo Cha nowadays is not only that this is a tea that has very interesting history, and obviously it's very comparable to matcha, which is popular now, so you can do some cultural comparisons as well. But also Mo Cha, this tea also exists in its loose leaf format as well as a very mature product. So for those of us, like even myself, who are so used to drinking this tea in the loose leaf green tea format, it provides me another opportunity to relearn about this tea. Oftentimes, when we say, the purpose or why we love tea is because it's a continuous journey to discover the characters of tea. And it's almost like getting to know another person.
Yeah.
And so if you truly love a person or like a person, right, you want to see this person kind of fletch in multiple environments and surroundings. And this is the same thing exactly that we're doing with tea. And it's exactly why we want to enjoy the same tea in the cold brew format, in the powder format, in this normal loose leaf format. Versus, I think matcha usually is not like the tencha is usually, and the aracha is usually not.
Aracha would never be available to customers. Or
especially the high-end ones.
Oh, yeah, especially that. Yeah. Although, not to brag, we are the only company that I know of that provides the tencha of all the matcha that we mill. But it's definitely not something that you would...
Yeah, it's not a common practice.
And part of that is because the way that they produce the tencha, it's meant to be ground. So they don't break the cell walls. They don't roll the green tea. So when you try to brew it like tea, it doesn't get a lot of the richness and complexity out of the leaf.
Yeah. Oh, that's a very good point, actually. Yeah. Yes, totally. Yeah. So this also, I mean, it's could be another expanded topic, but I definitely want us to think about kind of how the format of drinking tea, and how we process the tea, and the teaware that's involved are all interconnected. It's because in China that we started move away from powdered and whiskey tea. Loose leaf tea, where it has a clearer liqueur, that white porcelain saw the popularity, right? And also, like you mentioned, when a tea is meant to be enjoyed in the powder form, then you do not need to adopt steps like rolling the tea to release flavor, to layer the flavor, because the tea maker is considering how you are going to enjoy the tea. Versus in Chinese tea, for example, oolongs, because the tea maker know that you'll be brewing it in the gaiwan, so they actually layer the flavors in the tea in the way that when you brew it, how you're going to peel off that flavor. So it's all go hand in hand.
It's fascinating. One of the things that's so fascinating to me about this whole experience of grinding the mocha, and at the end of the day, it's the same plant, and yet being able to grind it and mill it and experience this massive breadth that this plant has. Essentially, it's the same plant. Right? But just some very simple changes in the production, you get these radically different experiences, both the aroma, flavor, body, texture, everything is different. And yet it's the same thing. Right? Like, what else could do that? Could an apple have that kind of breadth?
Right.
Just as the tea plant is so complex and has so many compounds in it that you can get so much of a different experience. And for me, that's really exciting to see. We have our mocha and matcha in front of us, and one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is the color of it and how the color is different between the two.
Totally. I think, as soon as you open up the powder packet, and we can see that matcha is of a much greener look. It almost, just want to spell out that, hey, I'm going to be a very green tea. Versus
almost artificial.
Right, exactly. It's like green dye. Versus the Mo Cha here has a much whiter, more subtle green color, and I understand in matcha evaluation, the green color is a preferred. Is that correct?
Yeah, usually the greener the color, the more electric lime the color, the better. The terroir is still most important, the processing, the shading technique. But in general, yes, it's usually a sign of quality to have a greener, more electric color.
Interesting, because in Chinese tea, it's almost the opposite. The greener color usually suggests insufficient processing, because it's supposed to turn a very dark, deep green color where the fresh leaves are into a paler green color. Chinese tea prefers a almost like a whiter hue to the tea. Oftentimes, even in the processed tea, so for example, this Mo Cha in its loose tea form, the guapian, once it's brewed, you're supposed to see the leaves are a little bit more transparent, versus the lower quality guapian usually will have a more solid greener color. So I find that is obviously there's a very clear visual difference, but there's also cultural perceptions of the quality that comes through as well.
And if I recall right, with Longjing too, like having a very bright green Longjing is
not a good thing. And also either suggests insufficient processing, or suggests that it was harvested later.
Yeah. Great.
So you wanted to have like a we call it an ivory green color. So it's almost like a little yellowish green color.
Yeah, I remember that with the Longjing.
So another very interesting thing that people did in Song Dynasty in the whisking practice that we can probably even try it out today, the tea maker would put a little bit water with the powder first and kind of mix it really well, and then add more water, and while they're adding water, they whisk it. So it's a very gradual kind of water going in and then whisking together kind of thing. So I wonder, what does that
I have
make?
No idea. It's fascinating.
What changes does it make to the taste?
I think that's
sure, we can try it. Yeah, because I think that's the thing that we can easily do it today to find out ourselves, right?
All right, so I'm gonna do the whisking.
Okay, great. The Song Dynasty style whisking.
All right, so
just add a little bit of water.
Just to make a slurry, right?
Yes, very thick.
This is almost like a koi cha, by the way.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I was gonna say I have a feeling this could be like a great sauce.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Very savory.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm gonna have you help me hold the bowl while I whisk, just so it doesn't
to stable it. Yes.
Or you can be the one to pour the water. You get to choose, but we'll do this way for now.
And I have a feeling that the reason it's suggested to do it like this because it's almost like it's like an emotion thing going on here. I think it might be able to make the foam to become even more, to come out even more aggressively, and maybe it'll make the tea more creamy as well.
Yeah, definitely reminds me of making a salad dressing right now.
That's just a theory. We're gonna try and then see if we're right.
Okay, so here is the different Song Dynasty method.
Yes, I can say that I think it visibly is a little lighter, the foam.
So being that this mocha is from you, you can come up with a technique of how to pick up the bowl and...
Oh, exactly. Yeah, I mean, just my excuse to go more simple and then lose all the proper Japanese manner.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I would say it is a little creamier. It's almost the bitterness is not as stand out.
Yeah, I agree. It's like an espresso where you have more of that crema.
Right.
It smooths it out.
Yeah, I definitely noticed the creamier you're able to make the tea appear, the creamier it actually tastes.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
So now we know that Mo Cha it still needs to be whisked the Song Dynasty way.
And it brings people together because you need a friend to hold the bowl.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah. So definitely try that at home as well and let us know what you think. So I'm super excited about this collaboration with Ooika, and I want to thank Mark for being a great partner. And we are going to have the Mo Cha available both on Tea Drunk and Ooika's website. So on Tea Drunk's website, you can also browse other Chinese teas as well, and you can drink this Mo Cha alongside with its loose tea form. And Ooika has an awesome selection of terroir-specific, freshly grinded matcha from the top terroirs of Japan.
And one of the most exciting aspects of this for me is that when you order the mocha, you have an option as a set to get the guapian with it, which is the unground version. Yeah, so that's really exciting. So you at home can try the difference between the two rather than just do it from memory.
Totally, yeah. I think that's another great tasting experience for your palate is to compare the same tea that's from the same terroir, same cultivar, same vintage, same tea maker, however, with a different extraction method, and can completely change your tasting experience. And on top of that, we'll also be offering both vintage specific Mo Cha as well as multi-vintage ones. So you can get both the 100% handmade 2022 Mo Cha or the semi-handmade, and we can also have a handmade multi-vintage Mo Cha as well.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I'm very excited for you to experience Mo Cha. And if you do get some and you do try it, be sure to tag us on Instagram so we can see.
Yes, and feel free to mix up your kind of whisking style as well and send us videos, pictures. We would love to know.